The prairie stretched endlessly under a burning Arizona sky, a restless ocean of yellow grass, cracked earth, and drifting dust that shimmered in the heat like broken glass, and at its center stood Red Rock Ranch, a hard-won empire of fences, cattle, and grit built by Jonah Reed, a broad-shouldered, weathered man whose face carried the weight of years spent battling storms, stampedes, and loneliness after losing his wife and newborn son in a single cruel night that left his house quiet and his heart hollow. One late afternoon, while riding the eastern fence line on his black stallion, Jonah spotted a lone figure staggering across the barren plain, moving so slowly it seemed the desert itself might swallow her before sunset, and as he drew closer he realized with a jolt that it was not a stray cow or drifting shadow but an elderly woman bent nearly double beneath a tattered bundle, leaning on a crooked stick, her boots worn through, her dress patched again and again like a map of hardship. He dismounted and approached carefully, warning her that the land ahead held no water, no shade, and no mercy, yet she met his gaze without fear, introducing herself as Ruth Halloway in a voice raspy but steady, shaped by decades of loss, and when Jonah offered her his horse and led her back toward Red Rock on foot, she accepted with quiet dignity rather than gratitude. By dusk they reached the ranch, where Jonah's hired hand Caleb stared in surprise at the stray his boss had brought home, but a single hard look from Jonah sent him scurrying for water while Maria, the ranch cook, set a steaming bowl of stew before Ruth at the long wooden table. The old woman ate slowly, carefully, like someone who had learned to respect every crumb, and when Jonah offered her the spare room for the night she resisted at first, insisting she would not burden him, before finally relenting under his firm but gentle insistence. At dawn Jonah found her already awake, broom in hand, sweeping the porch as if she had lived there for years, and by mid-morning she had helped in the kitchen, mended torn shirts, and sorted broken tack better than any hired man, leaving Caleb muttering that she worked harder than half the crew. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Jonah sat on the porch wrestling with memories of his dead wife when Ruth joined him, calmly explaining that bankers had taken her farm, leaving her landless, homeless, and wandering west simply because she had nowhere else to go. Something in Jonah cracked open then, not in anger but in aching recognition, and before he could stop himself he blurted out the words that would change both their lives. "Do you need a home, and a husband?" Ruth went utterly still, staring at him as if measuring the truth behind his question, and after a long silence she laughed softly, not mockingly but sadly, saying she was far too old for romance or wedding dresses. Jonah shook his head, explaining that what he truly meant was partnership, a shared roof, shared work, shared meals, and shared quiet against the loneliness that plagued them both, not passion but purpose. For 3 days Ruth stayed, cooking, cleaning, and stitching, and for 3 days Jonah found himself breathing easier, sleeping deeper, and smiling more than he had in a decade. On the 4th morning, however, dust clouds appeared on the horizon as a bank agent named Harrington rode in with 2 rough deputies, claiming Ruth still legally belonged to the bank's seized property and must be returned to a distant poorhouse. Jonah's blood ran cold as Ruth straightened her back and refused to move, declaring that she was a free woman, not cattle to be driven away. What followed was a tense standoff in the yard, rifles resting in scabbards, hands hovering near holsters, while ranch hands gathered behind Jonah and Ruth stood like an oak beside him. Harrington sneered that Jonah could not stop the law, but Jonah calmly produced a deed he had purchased that very morning with every spare dollar he owned. Not just for land, but for Ruth's independence as a homesteader under territorial statute. The agent blustered, threatened, and cursed, yet in the end he had no legal ground to stand on, and he rode off in a storm of dust and wounded pride. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, Jonah repeated his offer more gently than before, saying he did not want a bride but a partner, a home, and a future built on mutual respect. Ruth surprised him by taking his scarred hands in her own and accepting, not with tears but with steady resolve, asking only that they marry simply at dawn with no fuss or church bells. At first light, beneath a wide western sky, Caleb served as witness while a traveling circuit preacher happened upon the ranch and blessed their union, joining 2 wounded souls not by romance alone but by shared survival. In the weeks that followed, Ruth transformed Red Rock Ranch into a true home. Gardens sprouted where only weeds had grown, the bunkhouse ran smoother, and Jonah found himself laughing again at the dinner table. Yet peace did not come without trial, for a late-season storm brought flash floods that threatened to wash away the southern herd, forcing Jonah and Ruth to ride together through pounding rain, guiding panicked cattle to higher ground while lightning split the sky. Side by side they faced danger, proving that their bond was forged in grit rather than promises. Months later, when Jonah discovered an abandoned wagon with 2 orphan children inside, a boy of 10 and a trembling girl of 7, it was Ruth who insisted they bring them home, nurse them back to health, and keep them, turning the once empty ranch into a family. Years passed, seasons turned, and Red Rock grew stronger, not merely as a cattle empire but as a living, breathing home filled with laughter, hardship, and love hard-earned. When Jonah finally grew old and gray, sitting beside Ruth on the porch watching grandchildren chase fireflies across the yard, he remembered that first dusty afternoon when he had found a weary woman alone on the plains, and he knew with absolute certainty that stopping for her had saved not only her life, but his own.